She was standing beside a broken fence post at the edge of small farmhouse property just off the main road. 77 years old, if she was a day. White hair pulled back, oversized glasses sitting low on her nose. Her hands were shaking slightly as she tried to hammer a nail into rotting wood that had no business holding anything together anymore. She didn't look up when the bike slowed. She didn't flinch at the engine noise. She just kept working, quiet and stubborn, the way people do when they've learned that nobody's coming to help and they've made their peace with it. Damon pulled over. The others followed without being told. He climbed off his bike, walked to the edge of her property, and said simply, "You need a hand with that, ma'am?" She finally looked up, and that's when her eyes landed on his patch. She went completely still. Her hammer dropped into the grass, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "My son wears that same patch." The laughter that had been drifting between the riders a moment earlier just stopped, because that patch didn't belong to some weekend riding club. It belonged to one of the oldest, most respected, and most feared motorcycle brotherhoods in the country. And according to everything Damon knew, according to everything he had carried in his chest for 22 years, the last man from Red Hollow who wore that patch was dead. Her name was Clara Bennett. She didn't offer it like she was introducing herself at a dinner party. She said it the way people say their own names when they've been invisible for so long they half expect you not to care. Widowed, living alone. Her husband Raymond had died years earlier, a Vietnam veteran who never fully came home even when his body did. Her son Ethan had been her whole world after that. Quiet kid, angry teenager, decorated soldier, and then 22 years ago gone. She brought them inside, not because she trusted them. You could see in the set of her jaw that Clara Bennett didn't trust easily anymore, but because the alternative was standing in the heat pretending nothing had happened, and she was too old and too tired for that kind of performance. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and something floral that had long since faded from whatever candle she'd burned weeks ago. Unpaid bills sat in a stack near the toaster. A foreclosure notice was half-tucked under a fruit bowl that held no fruit. Damon saw all of it. He didn't say a word about any of it. Clara set a photograph on the table. Old, color faded to something close to sepia. A young man in military gear standing beside a dusty Jeep somewhere overseas. Big grin, patch visible on his jacket, and standing right next to him, arm thrown over his shoulder like they'd known each other their whole lives, was a much younger Damon Hayes. Damon picked up the photograph with the kind of care you give something you're afraid might disappear if you hold it wrong. His jaw tightened. A vein moved in his temple. One of the younger riders behind him quietly said, "Reaper, you good?" Damon didn't answer right away. When he finally set the photo down, his voice was lower than anyone had heard it. "That's Ethan." Then I watched him die. Clara didn't cry. She'd used up a long time ago whatever tears she had for that particular sentence. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her house dress and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of handling. She smoothed it open on the table. It was a note, handwritten, dated about 3 months before Ethan supposedly died. And the last line read, "Asterisk, if you ever see that patch again, Mama, it means somebody finally came back for me. Asterisk, how many of you would have walked away at that point? Just climbed back on your bike, told yourself it wasn't your problem, and kept riding toward Nevada? Be honest, because that's what the reasonable thing to do was. That's what the safe thing was." But Damon Hayes hadn't done the reasonable, safe thing a single day in his adult life. and he wasn't about to start now. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from people all over the world, and this story deserves to be heard everywhere. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one, they don't show up everywhere. Damon told his road captain to call Nevada and postpone. Then he pulled a chair out at Clara's kitchen table and sat down across from her like he had all the time in the world. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning." And Clara did. Ethan Bennett had come home from his second tour changed. Not broken, Clara was careful to say, but changed. He'd seen things. He'd also started paying attention to things in Red Hollow that most people had long stopped questioning. Specifically, he'd started asking about a veteran support fund that the county had received federal money for, money that was supposed to go toward housing assistance and medical care for military families in the area. Money that, as far as anyone could see, had never actually reached a single veteran's family. Ethan had gone to the county office. He'd been turned away. He'd gone back. He'd been threatened. And then, about 2 months after that, a story appeared in the Red Hollow Gazette with his name and face attached to an armed robbery that had allegedly taken place at a gas station on Route 9. Damon asked Clara if he could look at the clipping. She kept it in her Bible, the way people keep things they both need and can't stand to look at. He studied the date. Then he read the article again. Then he set it down. "Clara," he said quietly, "this article was published 2 days before the robbery was supposed to have happened." She stared at him. "I know," she said. "I noticed that the week it ran. I went to the sheriff's office." She paused. "He told me I was confused." The sheriff in question was Wade Mercer, 68 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who shook hands at church on Sunday and made quiet threats on Monday. He'd held that badge in Red Hollow for going on 30 years. In a town that's small, 30 years is enough time to own every room you walk into. When word reached Mercer that a group of bikers had parked their motorcycles at the old Bennett farmhouse and appeared to be staying a while, he drove out there himself that same afternoon. He didn't get out of his cruiser at first. Just sat there in the driveway watching Damon's men repair the broken fence, which they'd started doing without being asked because that's what they did. Then he stepped out, hitched his belt, and walked over with the particular stride of a man who is accustomed to people stepping back when he approaches. Damon stepped forward instead. Mercer said, "You people already ruined this town once. I'm not letting it happen again." Damon looked at him for a long moment and said, "We're just visiting family, Sheriff." The word family landed like a stone in still water. Mercer's eyes moved to Clara standing on the porch, then back to Damon. Something shifted in his expression, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. He got back in his cruiser and left without another word. That silence said more than anything he could have spoken. The next morning, an elderly mechanic named Roy Bassett showed up at the farmhouse before breakfast. 74 years old, hands like old leather. He'd worked the same garage on the edge of town for 50 years, and he walked up the porch steps like a man carrying something heavy on the inside. He asked to speak to whoever was in charge. When Damon came out, Roy looked both ways down the empty road before he spoke. "Ethan came to me," he said quietly, "about a week before he disappeared. He had documents, bank routing numbers, transfer records. The Veterans Fund money wasn't missing. It was being moved into private accounts. Mercer's name wasn't on anything directly, but his brother-in-law's was, and the county commissioner who signs off on the grants." Roy looked down at his boots. "I told him to drop it. I was scared. He swallowed. I've been scared ever since. Damon asked him one question. Did Ethan die? Roy shook his head slowly. That's the part one couldn't figure out for a long time, he said. There was a confrontation, out past the old Miller property. Shots were fired. I heard that from two different people who won't say it publicly. But there was never a body. And Mercer never wanted anybody looking too hard at that. He paused. I always wondered. That night, someone spray-painted a warning across two of the club's motorcycles. Get out or bleed. Damon photographed it, filed it with the state police tip line, and then went back inside and went to sleep. Because here's what 22 years of brotherhood teaches you. The people who write threats on motorcycles are the people who have already run out of real options. They're scared, and scared people make mistakes. The break came from an unexpected direction. A retired deputy named Frank Holloway, 61, had moved out of Red Hollow 8 years earlier after a conflict with Mercer he'd never spoken about publicly. One of Damon's men tracked him down through a veterans network 2 states over. Frank drove back to Red Hollow voluntarily. He met Damon at Clara's kitchen table at 6 in the morning, and he didn't need much prompting. He'd been waiting a long time to say what he said next. 22 years ago, Wade Mercer had arranged a staged arrest for Ethan Bennett on fabricated charges. But there was a problem. Ethan was a veteran with connections, and a public trial risked the documents he'd gathered becoming part of the record. So Mercer had called in a favor. A contact in the state correction system. Ethan had never been tried. He'd been transferred, under a different name, using a federal prisoner exchange process that existed for witness protection cases and had been exploited quietly for exactly this kind of disappearance. He had been held, then released after enough years that the town had forgotten, then placed in a veterans care facility out of state in a condition that made him unlikely to cause trouble. Nobody in Red Hollow had ever been told, including Clara, especially Clara. Damon sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked outside and stood in the yard alone for about 10 minutes. One of his men came to the door, and his road captain shook his head slightly. Leave him alone. What was happening inside Damon Hayes in those 10 minutes wasn't something you could describe easily. 22 years of grief. 22 years of believing he'd failed to keep his brother alive. 22 years of carrying a death that had never actually happened. That's not something you process in 10 minutes. But you can decide in 10 minutes what you're going to do about it. And Damon did. He made 2 phone calls. The first was to a federal investigative contact, a woman he'd met through a veterans advocacy network who worked financial crimes. He sent her Frank Holloway's statement, Roy Bassett's account, and photographs of the original newspaper article with its impossible publication date. The second call was to every chapter of his brotherhood within 500 miles. He told them to ride to Red Hollow. He told them why. And then he went inside and sat down next to Clara and said, "Your son is alive. We're going to bring him home." Clara didn't make a sound for almost 30 seconds. Then she pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table like she needed to feel something solid. And in a voice that barely held together, she said, "I knew it. I knew he wouldn't leave me." Think about what that woman carried for 22 years. Think about what it is to believe, against everything the town told you, against the official story, against your own creeping doubt at 3 in the morning, that your child did not abandon you willingly. How many of you have held on to something that long with no proof and no support? Because Clara Bennett did, and she was right. They found Ethan at a veterans care facility in eastern Kentucky. 61 years old now, thinner than the photograph, moving slowly. But his eyes, Clara's eyes, as it turned out, were clear. Damon made the drive personally. He walked into Ethan's room, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Damon said, "You pulled me out of that truck 22 years ago. Took me long enough to return the favor." Ethan looked at him for a long moment and said, "Took you long enough." And that was it. That was 22 years of brotherhood compressed into 4 words. The convoy that rolled back into Red Hollow 2 days later was not 8 bikes. It was somewhere north of 200. They came from 4 states. They filled Main Street from the gas station all the way to the diner, engines cutting off one by one until the whole street was quiet except for the sound of boots on asphalt. Nobody was armed beyond what the law allowed. Nobody threatened anyone. They simply stood there in the afternoon sun and waited. And the town watched. And Sheriff Wade Mercer, standing at his office window, understood that whatever wall he'd built over 22 years had just come down. Federal investigators arrived the following morning. The financial records Frank Holloway had kept, copies he'd made quietly before resigning 8 years ago, combined with Roy Bassett's testimony and the physical evidence of the fabricated article date, gave them enough to open a formal inquiry. Within 72 hours, Wade Mercer was escorted out of his own office in handcuffs on a Tuesday afternoon in Red Hollow, Tennessee, in front of the same people who had let him run their town for 30 years. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at anyone. He just walked to the federal vehicle the way men walk when the story they've been telling about themselves finally runs out of road. A black SUV pulled into Clara's driveway an hour later. Ethan stepped out slowly, one hand on the door frame to steady himself. Clara was standing on the porch, the same porch her son's brothers had rebuilt from new lumber 2 weeks earlier. She walked down the steps without using the railing. And when Ethan looked up and saw her coming, he said the only thing there was left to say, "I told you I'd come home someday." Ethan Bennett spent 3 months recovering at his mother's farmhouse, surrounded by people who showed up not because they owed him anything, but because that's what brothers do. The club established an annual veteran charity ride in Red Hollow, something the town, slowly and then all at once, began to embrace. Damon placed Ethan's old photograph inside the clubhouse wall under a small brass plate that read simply, "Never left behind." And Clara? Clara got a new fence, a repaired porch, a full refrigerator, and her son back. In that order. What do you think about what this town did to Ethan and Clara? Drop in the comments. I'm reading every single one. If this story hit you somewhere real, hit the like button and send it to someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, the previous videos are right there on the channel. Because sometimes the people society fears most end up being the only family someone has left.